Thanks for tuning back into Psychedelics today. Today on the show we have Peter Sjöstedt-H, psychedelic philosopher out of England. He is an Anglo-Saxon philosopher focusing on, right now, panpsychism, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Kant, and wrote a really interesting tract, Neo-Nihilism, that influenced some of the work of famous comic artist Warren Ellis. Works closely with Marvel Comics still. We had a really great talk. Peter being a philosophy guy and me having an undergrad in it made me a little jealous, but we got through it. We had a lot of fun. Peter also specializes in Whitehead right now and is of, which we spoke about before with Lenny Gibson. Lenny Gibson's kind of a strong Whiteheadian. Peter mentions in the episode that Lenny may have been one of the first people to write about LSD and Whitehead and how Whitehead can give a lot of context to the psychedelic experience. Eric Davis, kind of a famous writer, sci-fi futurist guy, talks about Whitehead a bit too. And Terence McKenna, I think, said he was the most psychedelic of the philosophers. So pretty cool that we got to get into that with Peter. I really appreciated the talk and had a great time talking to him. I think we'll have Peter on the show again in the near future because, as you can probably tell by listening to the show in the next hour of your life, you'll see that we barely scratched the surface. We could go a lot deeper with him. So that's it for the intro. I hope you really enjoy it. We have a lot of show notes on the website, so check that out. And, you can get his book and check out a lot of the references we have in there as well. So workshops, upcoming events, I guess top on my mind is tomorrow. Kyle and I are both flying out to Psychedelic Science 2017 in Oakland, the big MAPS event. Apparently the largest ever gathering around psychedelic science ever. So that should be really cool. It's right in downtown Oakland, and I'm really excited to meet a lot of the people we've had on the show. We're going to meet some people that have taken our class, and it's going to be really cool. I'm really excited about that. I wish I could stay for longer. There was some breath work, a holotropic breath work with Stan Groff that happened before the event. Really a little jealous of the people that got to do that. Someday I'll be rich and we can do that, but, who knows. Thank you all for listening. We really appreciate you tuning in. We're at I think we're almost to 50,000 downloads, and it's all because you guys keep telling your friends about it and sharing the love. Really appreciate you guys doing that. And if you want to support us, check out one of our workshops, tell your friends about the show, maybe give us an iTunes review or Stitcher review or something. Just post it on your wall. Anyway, I hope you guys really enjoy this episode. Peter's great, super smart. We have a lot of laughs in the show. He will actually be at the Breaking Convention conference in London in June. I really wish I could go to that. Hopefully next year I can go to more psychedelic conferences than I can this year. But I still am very lucky that Kyle and I, get to go to the Oakland MAPS conference. Can't wait. We'll report back on that on the other end. Anyway, back to the show. Enjoy Peter. Let us know what you think. See you on the other side. Bye. Hello, everybody. Psychedelics Today here. Joe, welcoming Peter Sjöstedt-H to the show. Thanks for joining us, Peter.
You're welcome. It really is a pleasure to be here.
So today on the show, we have a different angle. Typically, we talk to doctors or people doing kind of clinical work. Peter is actually a philosopher and has an interesting angle, kind of a Nietzschean, Schopenhauer, Whiteheadian approach to psychedelics and philosophy, and really excited to talk to him today. And Peter, so I wanted to kind of dig in and I think first thing, ask how or why did psychedelics really grab your attention?
Okay. Well, I was sort of a classic atheist, in my 20s, sort of Richard Dawkins reader, so on and so forth. And I was teaching philosophy in a college in London, and part of that was philosophy of religion, and part of that was teaching arguments for the existence of God and, different realms generally. But all the arguments seemed to fail on logical grounds, but there was one reason for believing in God or the afterlife, which was the argument from experience. And it wasn't based on logic, so you couldn't really use logic against it so much. So I was always interested in that. And then I related to that. I started reading William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And he talks about, he sort of equates the mystical state with chemically induced states. So he talks about nitrous oxide, ether, alcohol even, alcohol as the beginning of the mystical state, in fact. So that piqued my interest more. And that was in London, but my family home is in Cornwall in the UK. And one holiday term, I was walking a field with my brother, and he told me, look, I think these are little magic mushrooms here. And I was like, really? Okay, so maybe I could really link this to my studies or my teaching somehow. That was the excuse. And I picked, there was many, never found so many ever again, but, I picked quite a few. I took them home. I sort of made sure they weren't poisonous or whatever. I didn't know much about the mushrooms at all, really. Anyway, did some research on it, took them back to London, and then I tried a small dose, what you'd probably call a microdose today, just to make sure that, I wouldn't die or something. And then a week later, I took a heavy dose, relatively heavy dose of, they were Liberty caps. And it sort of changed me quite a lot. I mean, immediately, one thing, I'm mostly interested in the philosophy of mind rather than the philosophy of religion. So one thing it immediately did was to show me directly how powerful the mind can be. People who have not taken these things or done something analogous like breath work or whatever, I think they just don't know the power of the mind. Mm-hmm. So that was the first thing. And then that immediately hooks you in and makes you want to look into it more. And I looked at the literature, and there's not much philosophical literature on psychedelics. There is some, but not much, relatively speaking. So I decided to sort of engage on that mission myself. And then since then I've published my book, Numernautics, which is about that, and nihilism and metaphysics generally, and a number of articles, talks, and so on. Yeah, so that's where I am now.
So nihilism is an interesting thing. Obviously, we kind of have to make a lot of our own meaning, which is kind of what I fall on often. Mm. But
well, okay. Well, I was going to say, the interesting thing is that, of course, with the first wave of interest in psychedelics in the West in the 1960s, there was definite moral to it, or morale even, definite ethic to it, related to, I suppose, what you'd call the New Age and the hippie movement or whatever stereotype you want to use. And that was also, occurred during the Cold War. So there was this real desire for peace because of the fear of nuclear Armageddon and so on. Totally understandable. I think there's an aspect of psychedelics which is related to nihilism in this sense. And I use nihilism in a specific sense, neo-nihilism, I call it, which is that I think psychedelics often take you out of your society, your culture, and allow you to sort of view it in a sort of completely innocent, naive state, as a child might. And as a result, a lot of the sort of social mores and morals of one's culture suddenly can seem pretty absurd. Octavio Paz wrote about that, one of very few who did, Ernst Jünger perhaps as well. And so there's that, there's a sort of immediate experiential questioning of social mores, morals. So there's one tie. When I looked more into this, I realized that Nietzsche himself, who some people call a nihilist, he's actually a nihilist and an anti-nihilist, depending on the meaning of the term. Anyway, he himself took a lot of psychoactive drugs such as chloral hydrate and opium, of course, and a number of other things. So there's a lot. I have written a bit about that, but there's a lot more to be said about it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people really should kind of explore that a little bit more because it's very underexplored, but it should come up in those psychedelic sessions that people are having, like at least a battle with it, right? Like
at least a debate. Yeah, I think a lot of people would be against it because there's this sort of there's a kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, like way of thinking that proclaims that if you take psychedelics, then you become your whole ethics change into a certain direction, you know, a specific way of thinking about the world, which I don't think is necessarily true. At the very least, it's open to debate.
Yeah.
I think people come into psychedelics with a certain morality, and then they might be tempted to thereafter say, "Oh, and that's confirmed what I already believed in." But I question that really.
Right. Huh. Yeah, that's interesting. I remember the first time I had an experience. I did not want to go to school. I didn't want to. I don't know. I really didn't have too many goals. And after my first experience, it was like this whole rebirth. I was able to like reorganize some things, and like from that I was like, I kind of want to go back to school. I kind of want to study like the mind and consciousness, and before I was like, I'm not gonna like get myself in the system and get myself in so much debt with all the student loans and this and that. And then after that experience, it's like, well, actually I'm really curious in this stuff and I kind of want to go do that.
Yeah, I know it's a great educational spur in many ways, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of philosophy, but psychology, I mean, the main thing at the moment, as you sort of suggest, is clinical therapy, but there's so many academic avenues that it gives you the desire to pursue. I think it's a very useful tool in that sense. That's another thing as well, of course, that psychedelics are, by the mainstream, I would say, generally seen as a sort of slightly criminal activity linked to slackers, whatever you call it, and so on and so forth. I think this is a terrible misunderstanding. And if you look at the history of psychedelia, I mean, you just have to go back pre-60s to Aldous Huxley, and what's he called, William James, as I say, and others, to realize that there's a very interesting academic pursuit to be followed.
And there was this blog I think you wrote for Higher Existence, and you had all sorts of really cool citations giving some really cool historical relevance to the psychedelic project. I think quoted Plato a couple times, like trying to follow the Dionysian mystic path. It was very literally the case that it looked like he was trying to be a Dionysian in that passage, at least.
Yeah, I mean, you can say it's out of context, but there's the point of that article. I think it was called "The Psychedelic Influence on Philosophy." I think it was renamed by Higher Existence to something like the hidden psychedelic history of philosophy, something like that. But it was. But I mean, it's really just a list to show, look, these great thinkers of the past probably, well, sometimes definitely, in Plato's case, probably took what we'd today call psychedelics. How did that inspire them in any way? Interesting thing with Plato, of course, Whitehead is most famous for saying all Western philosophy is but a series of footnotes to Plato. And if Plato's famous for his dualism and his forms, and if these two tenets of Plato's were influenced by his psychedelic experiences at Eleusis or whatever other mystical festival he might have gone to, then that's saying a lot, isn't it? Because that's ultimately saying that psychedelic experience triggered Western philosophy. That is a conjecture. It's very hard to prove. Some people think, no, there was no psychedelic compound in the kykeon, in the potion. But when you really look into it, it's more likely than not that it was. I mean, Albert Hoffman famously conjectured that it was, that the ergot from the adjoining field at the Temple of Demeter contained ergot, which is the derivative of LSD, or LSD is derivative thereof. So there's a lot of, interesting pointers. But at the very least, I mean, you go through a number of these philosophers, Nietzsche, like I say, Schopenhauer, Thomas de Quincey, who was a Kantian writer.
It's Confessions of an Opium Eater, de Quincey.
Yeah. That's what he's known for, of course. But not many people know that he was one of the first English writers, one of the first English commenters on Kant's transcendental idealism. Again, there's just a load of missing research. It would be very fascinating to see how the sort of romanticization of transcendental idealism was somehow linked to opium or other psychoactive drugs at the time. There's just very little literature on it, Yeah. And so in a way, creating just this almost like a simple list of philosophers who took these drugs just is like, I don't know, a sort of offer for people to look more into it. I haven't got time to look into all of those links,
For people that don't know too much about those ancient Greek mysteries, would you mind giving like a brief little background about that?
Okay, I mean, it's not really my field, but I'll tell you what.
Okay.
A basic synopsis. I'll give you a basic synopsis. There were these mystery festivals in ancient Greece. I mean, they were originally linked to Dionysus, who was the god of dance, wine, intoxication, so on. And the most official, these festivals were where people, depended what they were, but people gathered and got into frenzies and partook of orgies and whatnot, and worshipped Dionysus, and so on, forest god. But there was one especially formalized festival, which was called the Eleusinian Mysteries, which were held in Eleusis, which is about 50 miles from Athens, where any person, including slaves at the time, could make an annual pilgrimage, stay there for about 2 weeks. They were the lesser and the greater mysteries. They're called mysteries because what actually happened there is a bit of a mystery, a bit like the Dark Ages are called that because we don't know much about them. But from what we know, there was a sort of procession, parades, certain rituals, certain priests were there, and one of the main parts of it was that people had to drink the kykeon, which is a potion, before they entered this dark chamber. And that's where I quoted Plato in that essay you mentioned in the Phaedo. And he says, we saw these sublime images, visions of this and that. So, yeah, very likely then that kykeon contained some kind of psychedelic compound, but hard to prove. I mean, there's an essay about the wine used in ancient Greece. That wine then was very different from now, and even that wine had psychoactive properties. So if that were the case, it would be much more plausible that it was the case in the mysteries as well.
Right, yeah, because then you're also getting into like the plant medicine aspect, because their fermentation was a little bit different.
Yeah.
They were including all these other plants into their wine mixtures, and so you don't really know what type of effects those really have.
Yeah, exactly, and especially when you consider it happened 2,500 years ago and beyond. So you can only speculate. In terms of what's more plausible, I think it's more plausible that it was somehow psychoactive.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting and kind of makes a lot of sense if you look at like the history of even not Greek, but more European, Northern European traditions, where we have a pretty strong record that psychoactive plants were used for very long periods of time. So it's really not that outlandish of a theory.
No, I mean, they found in Denmark, they found these burials of what we'd call witches today. They had cannabis seeds in their sachets and so on.
Didn't want to use the W word, but yes, witches. Yeah, absolutely.
Or whatever, sorceresses then, or whatever you call it. But what did the Danes call them? I don't know.
That's a good question.
But anyway, whatever they were called, they had cannabis seeds. Yeah, yes, you're quite right, I think. And also, Viking beer was apparently psychoactive. Henbane and so on. With it, I believe. But again, it's a bit out of my field, so I don't want to say too much about that.
Hear that? Yep, absolutely. So let's dig into this is always tough. How about this? Why do you feel that philosophy is important for the psychedelic world, or for philosophy of mind even? Like why do you think it's relevant that we should know about that, or like be exploring that stuff?
Well, there's a number of reasons. One of the prominent ones, I suppose, is this, that we don't, when I say we, I mean humans, do not understand how mind and matter are related. So, it's commonly called today the hard problem of consciousness. Before that, it was known as the explanatory gap. But, like hundreds of years ago, like Leibniz spoke of it, called it, it's known as Leibniz's mill. The ultimate point is this, that doesn't matter how complex the matter is that is correlated to mental states, no matter the complexity, we still don't know how things that move, like neurons, the sort of pulses and axons and whatever, no matter how much we know that and how well we know that certain parts of the brain are correlated with certain mental states like happiness or sadness or whatever, we still don't know why they are correlated. And that's a big mystery. That's, very well known in philosophy, like I say, for hundreds of years. But I don't think it's generally understood in the wider world. And when you see a lot of presentations at psychedelic conferences, like, we've done these brain scans on LSD, and we see this area here is activated or deactivated during psychedelic intake. What kind of explanation is that really? Because you could say anything. It wouldn't really tell us much about the psychedelic experience. Not much, something, of course. And of course, it's useful probably in terms of therapy. We don't know, for example, whether, like, for example, mental causation. If you think that when you work things out, that has an effect on your body, like writing the answer in pencil. If we go with a completely physicalist theory, that should be impossible, because only forces of, known forces of nature should have any effect upon movement. But nonetheless, if you deny that your thoughts can have an effect on your body, if you deny that, you're an epiphenomenalist, which means that, suffers a number of logical contradictions. The physicalist picture alone just cannot explain many aspects of consciousness. So that's one reason why I think philosophy becomes interesting and important for psychedelic discourse, just to show that, this is much more of a mystery than we believe. And once you've understood all of the neural correlations to psychedelic intake, you still have to explain so much more. So that's one reason why I think it's very important. Secondly, in philosophy, there's something called universal realism, which is from Plato again, theory of the forms. If you know it, that there exists these ideal, not ideas because they're not temporal, but these ideas, let's say sort of non-temporal ideas of everything, like the color red or the feeling of happiness. Bertrand Russell, for example, Whitehead, a number of other thinkers, Santayana, not to mention Plato, argue that this is real. There's a sort of a non-spatiotemporal realm which must contain these forms. Now, one of my latest essays on Whitehead and psychedelic phenomenology, looked into that and said maybe the psychedelic experience gives us more of a taste of this realm of forms, for example. This is something, again, that, you could not discuss in purely neuroscientific terms. In terms of philosophy of religion, it's very important. That's sort of how I got into it. Like I said, the mystical state, which is a massive part of philosophy, religion, theology, perhaps everyone can partake of this by simply ingesting certain molecules or whatever other method you have. What does that add to the discourse? So, so many, and not to mention political philosophy, what's the point of the law? Should these things be prohibited? So on and so forth, and ethics as well, and meta-ethics, as I've mentioned. I think there's a budding at the moment. There's going to be a massive field of psychedelic philosophy soon, when people really get into the logic of the matter, not just the sort of empirical data of the matter. Well, that's my belief and that's my hope. Maybe it will never happen, but we'll see. Time will tell.
So I see a handful of people working seriously on philosophy and psychedelics, like you are, Lenny Gibson being one. And it seems that Whitehead is a really useful framework for talking about a lot of this stuff, just because, like you said earlier, it's kind of a iterated Platonic philosophy.
It's modern
years later.
Plato. Sorry.
Yeah, go right ahead.
No, Whitehead does provide a massive system, his own metaphysics, really. Which is just explains so much with regard to all these other problems, like the explanatory gap. And it's so inspiring because it's so, in one sense, it's Platonism, but it's so much more than that, really, that you shouldn't really call it. One aspect of Whitehead is Platonism, the eternal objects, I should say that. But there's other aspects, like his actual entities and so on, and prehensions that are very radical, but under that system, one can look at psychedelic experience and just gain a number of new insights that you wouldn't in a normal metaphysical system. And of course, I think everyone has a metaphysical system. The common one today is, some kind of general materialism, which is not really thought out. It's just sort of the easy thing since Descartes. But there are so many cul-de-sacs there, so many problems with that theory, really, like mental causation being one of them, as I mentioned, that ultimately, let me restate it. Materialism or physicalism has been very useful in the modern age because it has led to technology, medicine, weapons, and so on. But it is a system, metaphysical system, that has reached a cul-de-sac. This hard problem of consciousness, although it's always there, people cannot go over that through that framework. So therefore, the only solution to these massive problems has to be something radical. Whitehead offers something radical, which does seem to resolve many of these issues. So that's why I've sort of, from all of the philosophy I've read, really, his ultimately makes the most sense to me. But so as a result, I think, that's a useful tool to look at psychedelics within. And that's really why I've got there. Of course, there are links from William James to Whitehead. And I'm sort of developing a strange hybrid of Nietzsche and Whitehead as well, which might work out, but we'll see.
It's a gamble, but it's a worthwhile one.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I'll never find out if it's wrong. But anyway, so that's my approach at the moment. But not only Whitehead, like I say, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Henri Bergson as well, William James, other thinkers. For example, Ernest Nagel, I'm reading now, is very interesting. My PhD at the moment is on panpsychism, which is not directly related to psychedelics, but it is related to Whitehead. That's another reason why I'm looking at Whitehead and psychedelics, because it is related to my official research.
And what is panpsychism?
Panpsychism is the notion that mind is universal. So it's not just something that emerges from brains, but is part of everything, every plant, every molecule, every subatomic particle. Everything contains an element of mentality. And this is Whitehead again, really. With regard to Whitehead, it's called pan-experientialism. But it's radical, but it's, I think, actually, obviously I think this, but it's highly plausible. As long as you don't mistake mentality for consciousness. So consciousness is being aware, being able to reflect on counterfactuals, like what would happen if I did this. That's consciousness. It has a number of different qualia, such as vision and hearing and so on combined. But by mentality, I mean something very basic, such as a sort of general subconscious feeling. That is not matter. It's not consciousness, but it is a form of mentality. And that, I believe, is within everything. And so then this problem, for example, of how sentience emerged from non-sentience, what I call the Big Pang problem, is resolved to the extent that you only get an emergence of degree of mentality rather than an emergence of kind, from matter to mind.
So this is very different from, say, like animism's perspective of everything actually has consciousness, like the mountain has consciousness, the rock, the tree. You're just saying that every matter in general has some sort of just intelligent type of form.
Yeah, I mean, it's different from animism in a way. Can be seen as a sort of old-fashioned religious version of panpsychism. The modern panpsychism I'm looking at would not really bequeath sentience to a mountain, because a mountain is not a self-organizing system. It's determined by external factors rather than itself, as opposed to, say, what we'd call an organism. So the mountain doesn't have any mentality as a mountain. It does have mentality in terms of all the molecules that constitute it, but those are individual subjectivities. So that's one sense in which it differs from animism. However, it's the same as animism, for example, with plants. It might say that a plant has single sentience, or it actually might say a plurality of sentience is there, depending on which type of panpsychism you go into. But I mean, a very basic way of looking at this is that animism is the religious version of panpsychism, whereas panpsychism is a sort of more philosophical version of animism.
So could you explain a little bit like what your current PhD project is looking at?
Okay, well, it's called Reformulated Panpsychism. So what I'm doing is, at the moment, I'm looking at the notion of emergentism, which is this. Jae-Gwon Kim, a philosopher of mind, says this is the default position since the 1970s, that somehow the mind emerges from complex systems of matter, i.e. the brain. Not necessarily the brain. It could also be possibly in the future, computer circuit or some alien kind of brain, which we might not define as a brain, but it comes from some organized physiological, organized material system. I'm looking at that, and I'm really looking at it in much detail, so to be able to criticize it in much detail, and that's what I'm currently doing, because panpsychism, in a way, seems the opposite of emergentism. So, in other words, instead of mind emerging out of matter, there is no such emergence. Mind was always there. So at the moment, my PhD is sort of negative, just very critical, but it's going to go into then a positive form, which will then be how a new form of panpsychism, which mostly draws upon Whitehead, how that can answer current problems in the panpsychic discourse. For example, the combination problem. How can different mentalities, different subjectivities combine to create one self, one individual, for example, is a big problem. The palette problem, how can different types of mentality combine to create a new one, so on and so forth. So it's really applying an aspect of Whitehead to modern debates in the philosophy of mind. It doesn't really include psychedelic phenomenology, but I will include little bits here and there which I can get away with, I mean, really, I wouldn't mind doing a PhD on psychedelic phenomenology, but the problem with that, of course, is that it's very, this is part of, this is a cultural problem in the sense that, when you do a PhD, you apply for funding, and panpsychism is like on the verge of being seen as totally bonkers, totally nuts. So if I were to introduce a psychedelic element, then there'd be absolutely no chance of funding, and very little chance of even getting a place at university to study it. There would be very few supervised. This is another interesting thing, because there is so little philosophical literature on panpsychism. Someone who's doing research, postgraduate research, PhD student, there's not much to research, in terms of literature. Therefore, it's a real risk to do a PhD based on that. So I think hopefully in the future, and I know this is part of your mission, hopefully when psychedelics have become, have lost their criminal and negative connotations, there'll be much more academic freedom but we're not there yet. In practical terms, we're not there yet. I know some people who have done PhDs on psychedelics, but they're few and far between.
You kind of have to go to some fringe schools to do it. And it's a little tough, but when you're finished, I think you could be kind of a gateway.
Yeah, well, hopefully, yeah. At least there'll be something to talk about,
Absolutely.
I shouldn't say that really. There are a lot of, there's always William James, as I say. Aldous Huxley was he wasn't really a proper philosopher because he was more of a sort of, literary writer. Not to demean him in any way. I think he's wonderful, but nonetheless.
The same way Nietzsche was, it's very similar kind of.
To an extent, it's inspirational writing, which rather than, depends how you understand philosophy really, but if you understand philosophy in an analytic sense, then they're not really philosophers. I don't look at philosophy that way, by the way, but some people do. And those people often have their money on their fingers on the money, So that's just the way it is. You have to deal with it.
So you've done some writing or speculation about transhumanism, is that right?
I haven't done much writing on it yet, but I have thought about it. My supervisor at the moment in Exeter University, he has published a number of books called Michael Housekiller. He's published a number of books on transhumanism, mostly critical. So through him, I've sort of really got interested in it. There's also the Nietzschean element of transhumanism. Nietzsche is seen as an inspiration to a lot of the modern transhumanist thinkers. And I've written a lot about Nietzsche, and so there's this strong interest. But also now, I will write soon an article about psychedelic transhumanism. It's something I just made up. All right? But bear with me. It's
why not?
Yeah, there's all this. One of the main things at the moment, of course, is microdosing.
Yeah.
Right. And I might have accidentally done it once, as I say, but I don't regularly do it at all. But, a lot of my friends say, it really works. I think there needs to be more studies out to prove that, because it could be a placebo thing. You might believe this is going to make my day great, and then you might think to yourself, I'm feeling great now because I took this, but actually it's not the substance. I don't know, but let's assume that it has got an effect. Then it's a nootropic, like a smart drug, it seems. And of course, smart drugs, nootropics, are very much related to transhumanism. Yes. It's a big aspect of their thought. So therefore, one can immediately then link psychedelics to transhumanism that way, as smart drugs. But then the interesting thing happens here in terms of culture, demographics, which is that smart drugs are used by the military. I mean, like the US Air Force use modafinil, right? What if they really did discover that, microdosing on LSD, say, had these amazing effects on your cognition? Would then the military be interested in, microdosing their soldiers? If they did, what a massive sea change there would be on the general perception upon psychedelics then, away from this peace-loving, mystical thing to something militaristic. And, the consequences of that, I think, would be profound. I mean, they would change the way people think about it quite radically. Also, I mean, microdosing today is often seen as something that is done, Silicon Valley office workers and so on, to make them more productive, right? So that then fits into a capitalist framework very well. And again, to generalize, but in the 60s, 70s and so on, or 60s and 70s, this capitalist framework was seen as something to be destroyed, taken over. Revolution, and that psychedelics would trigger that revolution. So it's an interesting developments could occur with this microdosing, I think.
Yeah, and that's interesting to go back to that point that psychedelics foster some sort of push against the culture, and then you have some of these people out in Silicon Valley really having a big influence on the culture that have pretty open use with psychedelics, or even looking at Steve Jobs, he talked about his LSD experience, and iPhones in everybody's hands nowadays. So he is the culture in some sense.
Yes. And I think it's very, very useful when people realize the inspiration that these substances can have upon, things we use every day here in the West, or in the world, in fact. They're extremely useful, and they're extremely inspiring. They're extremely educational, as we spoke of at the beginning. And they're not particularly dangerous. So it's just sort of crazy that they're prohibited in most lands.
I just finished reading this complete history of LSD, and it was called Acid Dreams, and it starts with the whole CIA thing, and then it ends with how depoliticized these substances are now, and just like you said, Peter, this the use or the kind of very particular subculture would define what they are useful for. Is it capitalism or war or what, or peace or therapy or whatever? It's very fascinating. And in terms of drugs accelerating transhumanism, it's totally relevant. And I think I heard you mention something about, we don't even know what kind of new molecules could come out just based on these brain scans that were released from the UK recently.
Well, I think, like I say, the future is unknown. I mean, it's an undiscovered country here. So many things could happen. I think there seems to be a fastening change here. It's really unpredictable. Really unpredictable. I think psychedelics will be decriminalized in Europe, most European countries, probably within 20 years.
Cool.
But at the same time, obviously, if you take a macro dose of psychedelics, you should be warned about that. The decriminalization should come with warnings,
Right.
And many people think, it's a sort of a spiritual experience in a pill, and that shouldn't be taken lightly. They're not. I mean, another thing I would like to happen is for people to see psychedelics as not really as a drug, because when you call them a drug, you compare it to cocaine, heroin, and so on. They're so different from these. so much more useful than these, that they deserve their own category, I think. And they should be handled with reverence, but nonetheless, they should be handled.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Lenny Gibson has this term, experiential philosophy.
Right.
Which I think is kind of helpful in terms of like, how do we contextualize this stuff, or breathwork even. And, you know, perhaps it is the purview of philosophy departments.
I mean, of all departments, you'd think so, yeah.
Right.
There's this other Swedish, I mean, I'm half Swedish, half British, but there's this Swedish guy who died a few years ago called Patrick Lundberg, who wrote about psychedelic philosophy. And his idea was that we shouldn't start with philosophy and try to interpret the psychedelic experience that way, but rather the psychedelic experience should inform the philosophy that might come out of it, which is an interesting thought, because, like, even as I'm doing, I'm looking at psychedelics through a Whiteheadian lens, really. But I wonder if it's possible for psychedelics themselves to offer a new philosophy. Maybe. I don't know. Again, there's research to be done here.
Absolutely. In a sense, it looked like Whitehead was kind of almost enraptured while writing a number of times, just based on stories from Russell or whoever saw him writing.
Yeah.
So yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, just in rapture, writing for 8 hours plus.
One of those, you get into the zone of creativity. And Schopenhauer actually wrote in regard to psychedelics, he said, and that was in the essay I wrote, for creativity, there's a perfect amount of wine or opium that can be taken, but take too much and you lose it all, you know, you're uncreative. So I think, yeah, I mean, like, again, with microdosing, maybe that could help, you know, art and writing and mathematics or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing with nootropics is that I think the Chess Federation have just banned modafinil. They've discovered that
Finally.
they discovered that people on modafinil are like 15% better at chess. I don't know how they worked that out, but they did somehow. So it's like drug cheating in physical sports. So, but you think in academia, at least, surely it's a good thing if people are 15% better at, you know, working out how to cure cancer or something like this.
Right.
Surely that's a better thing. But then there are other people who say, well, it's cheating and you should be banned as well, you know. And so that's currently a debate in nootropics, smart drugs. But then with microdosing, how will that, you know, come into that debate? I mean, if it's seen as a smart drug, then there'll be even more reason to ban it.
I find it really interesting when these things are banned from science, or people at least shun it. Like, is it really that bad to have better scientists or better researchers or whatever? But it's all. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's ultimately a question of, you know, what the point of science is, really, isn't it? And what's the point of life generally, the big philosophical question, because, of course, you can microdose and become more efficient at creating better weapons, you know, as a scientist, or better medications. So it's ultimately an ethical question, I suppose. And my own view on that is that there's no answer to such questions. You know, that you can't say this is the right way to live and pursue your life. You know, it's ultimately there's no arbiter there.
Right. And I think that's something that the West really hasn't dealt with yet. And I think we're on the verge of having to deal with it. But do you see any kind of resurgence in philosophy in the West at all? Or do you think it's just going to keep growing smaller? I saw my philosophy department canceled at my university.
Oh, did you?
Kind of sad. But yeah.
It's in university. I mean, generally, universities here, I mean, in Britain, terrible things have happened. I mean, I was the last year to receive a grant from the government to study. Now, then that grant was lost. But now students have to pay £9,000 a year or so to study, just the fees, not to mention, you know, accommodation, food and whatever, you know, so they come out of their course and they're like £50,000 in debt or whatever it may be. So that puts a lot of people off. also another aspect about universities is that they are somewhat redundant compared to a few decades ago with the internet. You know, you have so many lectures online, and email people quickly, and instead of a library, you have your e-library. You can quickly get what you're looking for. So what really is the point of a university? I mean, there are benefits, of course. You can speak to your experts on certain subjects in person. You can hang around with people who share the same interests and discuss these philosophical or whatever themes in the pub and so on. That's a massive benefit. But does that benefit justify £50,000 in 3 years? I mean, that's questionable.
I'm going through this right now. I'm doing an online program, like a low residency master's program. And I mean, that's one thing that gets to me. It's like paying all this money, but not having interactions all the time with my teacher. I'm doing a lot of like independent learning. And then, this project really just helps my mind going in the psychedelic world, which is great. But then sometimes I'm just like, what am I paying all this money for? Like, I'm not having any interactions. Like all my, all the students are all across the world, and it's a really strange thing. So like, I appreciate the online learning, but I also think like that community aspect is really difficult that I've been struggling with. So, yeah.
What are you studying?
Clinical mental health counseling and somatic psychology.
All right. Yeah. Well, especially in that field, you think face-to-face discussion would be useful, but but it's been an interesting debate for me, thinking about like the evolution of education and technology, and thinking about is online learning the best? Like, is having community really important for this? Well, I would say, I mean, it is better, but at the same time, you have to balance that, as I say, with costs.
Right.
And I think that's probably the solution is somewhere in between, which we haven't really formalized yet because of all the history of universities and so on, and because the internet is a relatively new thing, of course. So, but I think, there'll be some kind of fusion soon. Maybe the Open University's reached that point. In the UK, I don't know if you heard of the Open University, but it's been going in Britain for decades. It used to be on TV, used to record certain lectures on TV at night and whatever. They used to play it, when everyone was sleeping. And and then you'd meet up like every few months and discuss it with experts and with your classmates and whatever. So something like that perhaps is ideal. But who knows, again, what technology will bring. Maybe, ideally you'd have some kind of portal where you can just step out of your bedroom and go into the university campus, So, or maybe you can just have a little something injected into your brain, and then you've got all the knowledge immediately.
Yeah. Well, it's been kind of cool. Joe and I put on an integration course, and we've put this course up on Teachable, and we ran two versions. One was like a pre-recorded, so people can do it on their own time. But then I had a really fun time doing the live one where we're having face-to-face interactions. I think that's really helpful, which probably helps foster their community and human connection.
I suppose people are experimenting with different methods now.
Yeah.
What you're doing now, podcasts, of course, are in a way an education. Well, definitely an educational tool. Many, like yours, are. A number of others are, of course. So that's again, helps students understand, or people generally understand, current issues, whatever it may be, or historic issues.
As much as I want to keep this particular conversation going, I just had a bug in my mind about Warren Ellis, and I'm really interested if you could talk about, or what you could share about that project.
I wrote a number of years ago a little text called Neo-Nihilism, where I thought I'm going to experiment with a new style of writing, which is really harsh, hyperbole, based on like Nietzsche and Ragnar Redbeard and other writers like Emerson, perhaps. Something powerful, inspirational, not how I normally speak at all, not how I normally write, but, just experiment with it. And I did. I was teaching Nietzsche's book, Beyond Good and Evil. I had been teaching it for 6 years at that point. So I sort of distilled the elements of that into the book, and I combined it with a bit of Schopenhauer, who's a little bit more philosophical in a logical sense, combined it with a tiny bit of Hume. And I wrote it just as an experiment to get my thoughts down, really. And then, interestingly, someone came to me and said, "Hey, do you know how to put books online, like as an ebook?" And I said, I don't, but I'll look into it, actually. It's an interesting thing. So I did, and I just experimented and put my neo-nihilist text as an ebook on Amazon. I had to convert it into certain files and whatnot. Anyway, there it was, and I left it. And it started to sell, just a little bit here and there, and I thought, that's great. And then one day, massive spike in sales. I'm like, wow, what's happened here? And a week later, I discovered that there's this, in the comics world, there's this famous writer called Warren Ellis. He wrote like Iron Man 3, the movie, and certain Batman, X-Men, number of comics and films and other books, graphic novels and so on. He's a very well-respected writer. And he had written a little review of neo-nihilism on his newsletter, which gets hundreds of thousands of people. And so I thought, well, that's great. That's really nice. And I sort of sent him an email thanking him and that was that really. And then I got more money from this neo-nihilist book. But then Marvel asked him to recreate the character of Karnak. Now, Karnak was a sort of philosopher stroke martial artist created originally by Stan Lee, I believe, in the 60s as part of the Inhumans family. And they asked Warren Ellis to recreate him just when he was sort of getting into my work, getting into my novel somehow. And then he wrote again that he was inspired to recreate this Marvel philosopher superhero based on the work of primarily me and a guy in New York called Eugene Thacker. And he did. And the 6 issues of the comic have now come together as a sort of as a book, like a collection of all the comics in one. And now they're creating the Inhumans film. So Karnak is part of this family called the Inhumans, and ABC have teamed up with IMAX and Marvel to create a sort of movie/TV show. So the first 2 episodes, which sort of like movies, I believe, will be shown in IMAX, and then the rest will be a TV show. Anyway, I'm hoping to get the red carpet treatment for that one. But we'll see.
Is he English, Warren Ellis?
He is, yeah, but he's from the other side of England, so he's based in Essex, which is the southeast coast, and I'm in Cornwall, which is the southwest coast. I have spoken to him, via email, but we haven't met yet. But cool. I guess probably one day we will. But Karnak, yeah, it's a cool thing. I mean, I was never really into comics before, but I see their value.
He did a series called Transmetropolitan, which is really kind of wild. I want to call it post-apocalyptic, but it's like more like post-singularity meets post-apocalyptic dystopia. And this main character is this wild journalist, kind of like Hunter Thompson or something. Fascinating and worth it if you are into comics at all.
Yeah, well, I'm getting into it. I mean, I spoke to a guy called Dr. Paul Williams at Exeter University a few weeks ago about this, because the university have actually suggested that I get into comic book superheroes and philosophy, and there's potential funding for that and so on. Now, this takes me a long way away from my main interest in panpsychism, psychedelics and so on. However, I'm beginning to see a connection. So, like, for example, if you talk about psychedelic transhumanism, there's a connection from transhumanism, obviously, to superheroes. And transhumanism then with Nietzsche and the Overman, the Superman, and so on. And so, that I'm thinking about it at the moment. I'm creating links and interesting links and so on. So some kind of psychedelic Superman, maybe, that might be the title of my next book, something like this. Who knows?
I had that vision when you were talking about the fighter pilot using modafinil or Provigil, and then you accelerate them a little more. What kind of an entity is that's flying the plane at that point? That's a very different thing.
Well, imagine one on LSD.
Yeah, exactly. That's crazy. Crazy.
How about if they take too high a dose by accident when they're in that F-22?
There was this TV show where they actually did that, and it was hilarious. What was it called? Jack Black, The Brink. And the fighter pilot was actually like the modafinil dealer on the and they took the wrong pills, and it was ridiculous.
Really?
So worth it.
Look into that.
Yeah, I laughed very hard. So we've got a couple minutes left here before we've got to wrap. How can people get to your website, Peter?
My website is www.philosopher.eu. Nice. I'm on Twitter. Yeah, I was lucky to get that one, actually. Although there might be problems now that Britain is leaving the EU. Hopefully not, but we'll see. But that will be years. On Twitter, I'm Peter Sjöstedt-H, at Peter Sjöstedt-H, SJOSTEDTH. Facebook, Ontologistics, I've got about 6,000 people there now, so that's useful. Just Google my name and you should find me somewhere,
Great. Yeah, and we'll have all your links in our show notes.
Well, thank you very much.
There you have it. Peter Sjöstedt-H. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I did, Kyle did, and we really hope to bring some more of this to you soon. I personally think psychedelics and philosophy must go hand in hand. Yes, they're a therapeutic tool, but they're also a lot more. That's why there's all these different divergent opinions on what they are, how they should be used, scheduled in the drug legalization framework, all that kind of stuff. So food for thought, hopefully got you guys really thinking about directions that psychedelics could go in. So if you're a student inclined towards philosophy, why not investigate Whitehead and psychedelics? Perhaps that's an avenue worth going down. So if you want to support us, maybe sign up for our class, Psychedelic Self-Care and Integration. You can find it on our website, psychedelicstoday.com. And you can learn a ton about psychedelics, how to be safe with them, and some ideas about how best to use them for particular outcomes that you're looking for. So be safe out there, get educated. One thing I heard recently was if you can afford to ingest, you can afford to test. There was recently a batch of I think it was cocaine going around laced with fentanyl, which is a very powerful opioid that's killing a lot of folks just because the dosage is so huge. And if they tested, they could have found that out. It's tainted. And people wouldn't have died. So test, and be safe. Take risks, but calculated ones. So again, thanks for tuning in, and we really appreciate you guys checking us out. Tell your friends. Take care. Bye-bye.